The storm had been pounding Mill Creek all night. Inside the old VFW hall, laughter echoed, careless loud, trying to outshout the thunder. And then, in the corner, a retired Marine set down his coffee cup, the same way a man lays down a burden he's carried too long. No one noticed him, not yet. But before that night was over, his name would bring the whole room to silence, and remind a town who still kept its roof from falling. If you believe some heroes never stop serving, even when the world forgets them, this story is for you. But to understand how we got here, we have to go back to where the storm first began. Thunder rolled over the rooftops of Mill Creek, a small town stitched together by cornfields and Old Glory flags. The rain came in steady waves, tapping against the windows of the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall on Main Street. Inside, the faint hum of a jukebox blended with the smell of wet boots, brewed coffee, and the distant crackle of a storm radio. Beneath the flicker of a neon Bud Light sign, a few guardsmen laughed too loudly, their voices echoing against wood-paneled walls lined with photographs of men long gone. At the far end of the bar sat Caleb Ward, a retired Marine Scout sniper turned local carpenter, his back straight despite the weight of years. His weathered hands cradled a chipped coffee mug, and beside it lay a tarnished challenge coin, a small circle of metal that had outlasted medals and memories alike. He didn't look at the photos. He didn't need to. Every face on that wall had already followed him home in dreams that never quite left. Outside, lightning flared, reflecting off the glass frame that held a folded flag. The flag's colors had faded with time, but its meaning hadn't. Across the room, Pastor Holly sat quietly at a corner table, his Bible open, his eyes lifted every now and then toward Caleb, the way a man looks at someone who carries a story he's not ready to tell. The laughter of the young soldiers grew louder, breaking the stillness like a cracked bell. One of them slammed his beer down and shouted over the music, bragging about his latest weekend mission and the training he'd almost completed. Their voices carried the restlessness of boys trying to sound like men, unaware of who listened just a few feet away. The bartender, Eddie, polished a glass and gave Caleb a nod, half greeting, half warning. But Caleb only smiled faintly, his eyes steady on the storm outside. "Weather's turning rough," he murmured. Eddie nodded again, understanding the double meaning in the words, not just about the rain. A gust of wind rattled the door, shaking loose a hymn card pinned near the register. The words, "Blessed are the peacemakers," fluttered to the floor, landing by Caleb's boot. He reached down slowly, his fingers trembling slightly, and placed it on the counter beside his coin. The young guardsmen didn't notice. They were too busy laughing. The old man traced the edge of his coin with his thumb, each groove worn by years of memory. To anyone else, it looked like habit. But inside, Caleb was counting, not the days since his service ended, but the moments his silence had held this town together without them ever knowing. When thunder cracked again, it shook the glasses on the shelves. The neon sign flickered twice, dimming the room into a muted gold. For a heartbeat, the sound of laughter faded, replaced by the whisper of rain and the creak of old floorboards. In that silence, it almost felt sacred, like the storm outside was keeping watch. Caleb glanced toward the wall of names, whispering to no one in particular. "You boys still keeping this place standing," he said quietly. His words vanished into the air before anyone could hear them, but Pastor Holly did. And he knew. The night had just begun to remember. It started with a harmless joke, the kind of careless laughter that fills the air when people forget where they are. One of the younger guardsmen, his cap turned backward and confidence turned high, squinted toward the end of the bar. "Hey, old-timer," he called out, voice cutting through the hum. "You come here for the discount coffee or just to tell stories about the war that never was?" The laughter that followed came too quick, too loud. The bartender froze mid-pour, eyes flicking to Caleb. Pastor Hale's Bible closed softly, his hand resting on the worn leather cover. Caleb didn't move. He just took another sip of coffee, steady, quiet, unbothered. Or at least it seemed that way to everyone watching. The young man smirked, mistaking silence for weakness. "What's that coin for, old man? You win it at a carnival or something?" Another round of chuckles rolled through the room. Rain hammered the roof harder, as if heaven itself was losing patience. Eddie, behind the bar, muttered, "That's enough, fellas," but his voice was small against the noise of pride and ignorance. The guardsmen laughed again, slapping each other's shoulders, too young to see the reverence in the walls around them. The old photos stared down like witnesses, their smiles frozen in sepia as the air thickened with disrespect. Caleb set his mug down carefully. The sound of ceramic meeting wood was louder than thunder. His hand rested on the coin, thumb pressing against the inscription worn smooth by decades. Still, he didn't look up. He let the rain speak first. Pastor Holly rose from his chair, slowly, as if pulled by something unseen. "You boys ever stop to think who built this town?" he asked, voice low but clear. "Who laid the wood under your boots, or the roofs you sleep beneath?" The soldiers quieted, unsure if it was a sermon or a warning. One of them scoffed, still unwilling to back down. "Guess it wasn't him," he muttered under his breath. "Old folks just like to say they did." The others chuckled nervously, but even they could feel the tension shift. Caleb finally lifted his head. His eyes, calm but unyielding, met the young man's. "Son," he said softly, "you don't know how many roofs you stand under that were built by the same hands that held a rifle, so you could laugh in peace." His tone wasn't angry. It was something heavier, something earned. The hall went silent. Rain drummed steady against the roof, and every man in the room felt smaller for it. The young guardsman swallowed hard, trying to look away but couldn't. Pastor Holly sat back down, whispering a prayer that only one man in the room truly understood. Outside, the flag whipped in the storm, its edges frayed but unbroken. Inside, the air carried something between shame and awakening, the first quiet spark of remembrance in a town that had forgotten who kept its light burning. The laughter in the hall finally began to fade, breaking apart like the last drops of a passing rain. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Silence followed him wherever he stood, the kind of silence that made men listen without knowing why. His fingers stayed wrapped around the handle of his mug, the coin glinting faintly beside it. The young guardsman, still trying to look tough, shifted in his chair as the thunder outside rolled long and low, echoing the tension that had filled the room. Eddie looked up from behind the bar, eyes darting between Caleb and the group of young men. He'd seen this play out before, pride against patience, ignorance testing the quiet strength of a man who'd already seen too much. Pastor Holly didn't move, though his lips trembled slightly as if whispering a prayer he'd prayed many times before. The veterans at the far tables kept still, the storm outside now beating a rhythm on the roof like a slow, heavy drum. Caleb finally broke the quiet. "You boys done?" he asked softly, his voice rough like gravel, yet strangely calm. It wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation to think. The one who had mocked him earlier let out a nervous chuckle, unsure how to respond. Caleb's eyes didn't waver, steady and clear, as if looking through the young man into something deeper, something older than the noise of pride. "Just having a little fun," the kid muttered, his tone losing its edge. "Didn't mean nothin' by it." Caleb nodded, eyes drifting toward the window. "That's the thing about meaning," he said quietly. "You don't always see the weight of it till you drop it on someone who's already carrying more than you know." The words hung in the air like dust in a shaft of light. No one dared to breathe too loud. Outside, the rain poured harder, blurring the view of Main Street. A lightning flash illuminated the framed photographs, faces of men and women who'd given everything for the town now hiding from the storm. Pastor Hale's gaze followed the light across those pictures, and then back to Caleb, realizing the truth. The man sitting in that corner wasn't just another veteran. He was one of the reasons this town still had walls to shelter beneath. Caleb's hand trembled slightly as he picked up his coin. He turned it once in his palm, thumb brushing against the faded engraving of a chapel silhouette. His reflection shimmered on the metal, distorted by time. "Most folks," he said after a moment, "only remember the fireworks. They forget the fire that made 'em." His tone wasn't bitter. It was simply the sound of truth, worn smooth by years of repetition. Eddie tried to ease the tension. "Another coffee, Caleb?" he asked, already reaching for the pot. Caleb shook his head, a faint smile tracing his lips. "No, thanks. And think, this one's gonna need to settle." His voice carried both weariness and grace, the tone of a man who'd learned peace the hard way. A quiet murmur spread among the veterans at the back, those old enough to recognize the weight in Caleb's words. The young guardsman looked away, his earlier arrogance replaced by an unease he couldn't explain. The storm outside rattled the flagpole, the halyard clanging like a bell of reckoning. Pastor Halle finally rose to his feet and took a step closer. "Sometimes," he said gently, "still waters don't mean peace. They mean depth." Caleb looked up at him, their eyes meeting in mutual understanding. They both knew something sacred was about to surface. For the first time that night, the hall went completely still. No laughter, no whispers, only the sound of rain and the hum of an old neon sign flickering on and off. In that stillness, truth waited, patient, quiet, and unyielding, just like the man who carried it. The young guardsman, unable to bear the silence any longer, forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Come on, old man," he said, trying to reclaim control. "You even serve, or you just hang around here for the stories." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying more fear than confidence. Caleb didn't move. He took one slow breath, the kind that carries decades of memory. His coffee had gone cold, but his patience hadn't. The thunder outside rolled like artillery in the distance, steady and rhythmic, as if the heavens themselves were waiting for his answer. He set the mug down gently, fingers brushing once more against the coin beside it. "You could say I did my time, son," he said finally, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through pride. The words landed softly, but they carried the kind of authority only earned in places where survival isn't guaranteed. The young man swallowed, forcing a smirk he didn't believe in. "Yeah? Where at?" Caleb's hand stilled. His gaze lifted, meeting the eyes of every man in the room, not confrontational, not proud, just honest. And then he spoke two words that froze the air itself. "Lantern 1." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The laughter that had filled the hall only minutes before was replaced by a heavy silence. The bartender's towel slipped from his hand, landing in a puddle of spilled beer. Pastor Hale's eyes widened slightly, then lowered in quiet reverence. A storm siren wailed faintly in the distance, drowned out by the collective realization washing through the room. The young guardsman blinked, confused. "Lantern what?" he whispered. But one of the older vets at the corner table, a man who'd been silent all evening, whispered back, voice trembling, "Son." Lantern 1 wasn't supposed to come home. The air changed. It wasn't just recognition, it was reverence. Eddie stepped closer, his voice barely audible. "Operation Prairie Lantern," he said, almost to himself. "They said the squad never made it back." But he did. He turned toward Caleb, eyes shining with something between pride and disbelief. Caleb looked down again, eyes on the coin. "Most didn't," he said quietly. "Some names got lost in the papers. Mine just got buried with them." His voice carried no anger, only the gentle ache of someone who had made peace with being forgotten, until now. Pastor Halle stepped forward, his voice soft but steady. "The Lord keeps his own records," he said, resting a hand on the back of Caleb's chair. "Paper might forget, but heaven doesn't." Caleb nodded once, a small grateful motion that said more than words could. The young guardsman took off his cap, shame coloring his face. "Sir, I didn't know," he whispered. Caleb met his eyes and offered the faintest smile. Now you do. That's what matters. As thunder rolled across the horizon, the storm outside seemed to ease, not gone, but gentler, as if the heavens themselves were bowing in respect. Inside, every man in that hall understood that something sacred had just been spoken aloud. The forgotten light had returned, and it would never go out again. Eddie leaned his forearms on the counter, eyes on the coin that gleamed under the neon. His voice dropped to a hush, the way men speak in sanctuaries when memory turns holy. "Operation Prairie Lantern," he said, more to the wall of faces than to the room. "They said the squad got swallowed by weather and politics and a broken radio. A story folks stopped telling, because paper said it wasn't there." The older veterans shifted in their chairs, as if a cold wind had moved through the hall. One man nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting years to hear the name aloud. "Some of us heard pieces," he murmured, "but the trail always ended in silence, like stepping into snow and finding no footprints ahead to follow. You learn to live with the not knowing, but it never leaves your bones." Pastor Holly stood nearer, keeping his voice even so it wouldn't break. Men came home with empty sleeves and quiet eyes that didn't ask for parades. They carried breakfast tables and children on their shoulders just the same. And on Sundays, they bowed their heads without insisting on a pew with their name. The town grew sturdy, because someone chose the heavier load and said nothing. Caleb rested a palm on the counter, the wood scarred by years of rings and elbows. He didn't grandstand, didn't rise, didn't reach for anything dramatic or loud. "Bad storm, bad maps, and a worse plan," he said, each word carefully chosen. "We were told to keep folks alive and make it look like nobody moved an inch. Some stayed behind to make that true, and I still see their faces when the rain comes." The young guardsman stared at the coin as if it might speak for him. Shane softened his shoulders, but curiosity steadied his gaze. "What happened after?" he asked, "when you got back to the people in charge?" Caleb's thumb traced the chapel carved into the metal, a circle of light and steel. "They thanked us, then folded the page like it might crumple into the night." Eddie filled a cup with fresh coffee and set it gently by Caleb's hand. His eyes were glassy, not from the storm, but from the weight of recognition. "We kept hearing whispers," he said, "about a rescue nobody could sign for. A ledger with all the zeros lined up, but no names in the right boxes. And the more you looked, the more the ink thinned out like rain." One of the older vets cleared his throat, voice rough as a gravel road. "Folks think honor is a fireworks show and a speech with a strong chin. They don't remember the days after, when the quiet carries most of the load. They don't see the houses built by hands that used to steady a rifle, or the way a man learns to measure words like a carpenter measures board." The laughter in the hall was gone, replaced by the hum of neon and rainfall. Even the jukebox seemed to listen, the tune fading into a low electric whisper. Pastor Holly folded his hands, not to preach but to keep them from shaking. "Truth doesn't need a stage," he said, eyes wet with a private prayer. "It just needs a place it can stand without being pushed out the door." Caleb's gaze drifted to the wall, to faces caught forever at 23. He squared his shoulders the way Marines do when a memory demands respect. "Men did right at the cost of being seen," he said, quiet as a benediction. "They took the blame of being forgotten so the mission could stay whole. And every day since, I've tried to build something worthy of what they lost." The young guardsman exhaled, a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He reached up and straightened the cap he'd just removed, eyes on the floor. "Sir," he said, the word more a promise than a title in that moment. "If there's work that needs doing, I can do the hauling and keep the nails straight. Anything that helps carry what I didn't see before. Tonight." Eddie looked around the room and decided the story would not vanish again. He took a bar rag, wiped a small square of the glass case below the photos. "Names have a way of finding their way home when folks agree to witness," he said. "Paper can hesitate, but people can decide what's written on their hearts. And with that, the town's forgotten history stood up and took its first breath. The storm leaned hard against the windows, drumming steady like a marching band. Caleb wrapped both hands around the warm cup as if heat could anchor the past. When someone called him a hero under his breath, he barely shook his head. "Used to be," he said, the words gentle and worn thin by time. "Mostly I build things now, so the people I miss still have places to live." Pastor Howell placed 2 hymn cards side by side, smoothing their bent corners. He wasn't arranging paper. He was arranging his courage for what might come. "Some honors break a man," he said softly, not looking up from the table, "because they remind him of faces who never stood beneath the banner again. And some honors mend a town because they teach us to carry memory with care." A veteran with a limp straightened slowly, steadying himself with the chair back. "Not every scar asks for applause," he said, voice quiet but certain. "Some just ask for room to breathe and a way to keep working. I reckon a pew sanded smooth can carry more truth than a brass speech, because the hands that sand remember what the lips forget." Caleb nodded, eyes finding the door as wind shoved it in its frame. "The quiet kept me safe after the files got shut and locked," he said. "Quiet let me hear the voice that told me to keep my temper on a leash. I started counting victories by roofs that didn't leak and steps that didn't creak. By the way a family slept easy when the boards stopped complaining." The young guardsman stepped closer, still hat in hand, humbled but awake. "If silence was the price," he asked, "what brings you to speak tonight?" Caleb let the question sit, like a tool on a bench waiting to be chosen. "Sometimes a town forgets because a man kept his promise too well," he said. "And promises need updating when they start hiding what should be seen." Eddie shifted a photo an inch, the frame catching a flash of lightning. "We keep the lights on," he said, "but it takes more than bulbs to see. Sometimes you need the storm to flicker the room and show the dust. Sometimes you need a name to cross the floor like a nail through oak, so the structure stops wobbling and holds like it was meant to hold." Pastor Hall drew a slow breath, as if tasting the question he had to ask. "If men arrive from town or beyond," he said, "and ask you to hush again." Caleb smiled without joy, a craftsman considering a flawed blueprint. "I'll answer what I owe to truth and keep what I owe to the dead," he said. "Restraint isn't surrender. It's strength taught by 1,000 hard mornings." The veterans exchanged glances, counting what might soon be required. No one wanted a standoff, yet everyone felt the pressure shifting in. Storms sometimes announce visitors who carry papers thicker than mercy. And small towns learn to brace doors without breaking their welcome. They prayed for wisdom, not thunder, and for the courage to stay calm. Caleb set the coin flat on the counter, centering it with carpenter precision. "If there's a reckoning," he said, "let it remain a decent and lawful one. No shouting, no pushing, no forgetting we're neighbors before anything else. We'll speak slow, and we'll leave room for a man to do right in public. That's how a town keeps standing. When the papers say to sit down, the rain softened just a little, trading fury for a steadier hymn." Pastor Holly closed his eyes, lips moving with a verse about light and darkness. The guardsman looked at the photos and tried to memorize every name. Eddie topped off the coffee and wiped a ring the mug had left behind. And the room settled its shoulders, ready for whoever might step through the door. The door pushed in against the wind, hinges crying out like an old memory being forced open. Rain spilled across the threshold before the bartender could grab a towel and block the draft. A figure stepped through in a dark coat, shoulders squared, cap pulled low against the storm. Water ran from the brim, tracing a line down a face cut by years of orders obeyed and given. Every conversation thinned to a whisper, then vanished, as if the room had inhaled and held. He paused inside the entryway and took the weather like a man who had seen worse. The coat came off, revealing a retired colonel's dress beneath, metals muted by the dim light. He didn't look left or right. He looked past everyone, eyes searching for one still point. When those eyes found Caleb's corner, the man's jaw settled into a familiar command. "Lantern 1, he said, the title falling like a gavel neither of them wanted to hear again. Eddie stopped wiping the counter and stood tall, towel twisting once in his hands. Pastor Halle slid a palm over the open Bible, not to close it, but to steady his nerves. The young guardsman stepped back, instinct putting space between pride and consequence. The older vets rose halfway, chairs scraping a respectful inch and then holding fast. Outside, thunder rolled a warning. Inside, the silence signed for delivery and received it. The colonel's gaze carried the weight of a room where walls remember everything. He walked forward with the deliberate caution of an officer entering a chapel. Boot heels tapped a metronome against the wood, measuring what could not be rushed. He stopped 2 paces from Caleb, neither looming nor bending, just holding the line. "Thought you were finished speaking that name," he said, voice clipped and careful. Caleb didn't move to meet authority, didn't shrink from it either. He simply remained. His hand rested near the coin, as if it were a promise he refused to set aside. The storm flared white on the windows, and the flag outside snapped hard in answer. "Finished is a word for building when the roof stops leaking," he murmured. "I kept quiet until quiet started hiding men who deserved to be seen." The colonel's expression faltered, a crack through stone that healed itself too quickly. "You were told to let that operation lie," he said, keeping his cadence professional. "It was sealed for reasons above your pay grade, above mine, above any of us." His eyes drifted a heartbeat toward the wall of photographs and then returned. "Bringing it up in public opens doors we boarded for everyone's sake." Pastor Halle stepped a little nearer, hands still visible and unthreatening at his sides. "This hall has seen doors open for mercy before they were opened for judgment," he said. "Sometimes the town needs to hear what the paperwork could not bring itself to carry." His tone was not defiant. It was the still water that makes men hear their reflections. The colonel took that measure and chose not to reply, which was reply enough. The young guardsman swallowed and started to speak, then thought better of it. He put his cap against his chest and shifted to stand with the older veterans. Eddie drew one breath, slow and heavy, as if he'd lifted a beam into place. Caleb kept the room level by refusing to tilt, his restraint the unseen brace. "Colonel," he said softly, "you know why I stayed quiet when quiet was honest." For a moment, the colonel's eyes softened with something past command and closer to debt. Rain ticked on the roof like a count he could not stop reciting under his breath. "Orders were orders," he said at last, each word cut square to fit a rigid frame. "Lives were protected by erasing the path we took to save them. That was the call." He set his cap on the bar beside the coin, 2 circles of authority that meant different things. "Maybe both were needed," Caleb answered, "until the cost shifted to the ones left behind. The town's peace sits on beams no one sanded, because the names were filed away. That's not vengeance speaking. It's stewardship, the kind carpenters learn by hand. We are not tearing down, only letting light through joists that time has darkened." The colonel breathed out, and the storm answered with a long, reluctant sigh. Lightning washed the room in white, then left it humbler in the dim that followed. The colonel drew closer, not in threat, but in the gravity of men who shared a night once. "You should have stayed gone," he said quietly, and the words were not unkind. "They buried that mission so reputations wouldn't bleed into coffins already full. It spared careers, spared families, and so we believed spared another war inside." Caleb turned the coin until the chapel, engraving faced the ceiling like a prayer. "When the paper buried the mission," he said, "it buried the men who gave it breath. They taught me to keep anger on a leash and let the work speak for itself. I did that as long as silence told the truth better than my voice could. But silence has started to lie, and the town is the one being lied to now." The colonel's mouth tightened, the habit of argument loading and then standing down. "I carried that order like a cross I didn't earn," he admitted, low enough for Caleb first. Every time a family asked, I gave them a hallway and a locked door. Duty is supposed to save, not erase. I know the difference in my bones. And yet I enforced the erasing because the line right through my desk. Pastor Halle lifted his eyes, the kind of look that invites men back to their courage. Truth is not an enemy of peace, he said, voice even, weathered, and merciful. It is the scaffolding that keeps peace from falling on the children underneath. If the town learns by standing still and listening, we can carry it without breaking. Let what needs confession be confession, and what needs restraint be restraint. Outside, SUVs ghosted through the rain down Main Street, headlights thin and pale. Someone near the window murmured that more company had braved the storm. The room did not rattle or scatter. It settled deeper into its own foundations. Eddie slid the colonel a dry towel, not as a favor but as a reminder of neighborliness. Even the jukebox seemed to hold a respectful silence for what approached the door. The colonel's eyes flicked toward the glass, then back to Caleb with a soldier's arithmetic. If they ask you to come in, he said, you know what I will have to say. Caleb nodded, not in surrender but in recognition of a burden honestly named. No guns, he answered quietly. Not tonight. Not for this. We are going to stand here as men and as a town, and we will use our words. The young guardsman found his voice, careful as a man setting a beam into place. Sir, if words fail, we will keep them from failing by staying decent, he offered. One of the older vets grunted his approval, like a fence post driven true. Pastor Halle half smiled, a tired joy that belongs to shepherds after long storms. Decency is the language truth prefers, he said, and the only one worth its cost. The colonel faced Caleb again, the stormlight sketching the years across both of them. I told them you were a professional at restraint even when the sky was on fire, he said. That you saved more by holding steady than most did by charging forward blind. If there's a way to honor both duty and the men it forgot, show it to me now. Caleb answered with a silence that brimmed with words, then chose the smallest ones. Take off your cap when they come, he said, not as an order but as a path. Put it over your heart and let them see which uniform you are wearing tonight, the one for office, or the one for conscience, which is the true rank of a man. I'll do the same with nothing but my name, and we'll let the town decide the rest. The colonel looked at the cap, then at the faces, and nodded like a vow reached him. Rain slackened to a steady hymn that ordinary roofs understand and hold. The flag outside snapped once, then settled into a disciplined ripple of color. Inside, the room reset its shoulders, and even the floorboards seemed to agree. If the truth was going to enter wet and shivering, it would find towels and chairs. And it would find men prepared to carry it with the care owed to living things. The colonel's words faded, and the room received them like a church receives rain. Men adjusted their shoulders, but did not reach for tempers or old grievances. A hush fell that felt less like fear and more like shared responsibility. The photographs on the wall seemed to lean closer without moving an inch. Mill Creek, for once, decided to listen with its whole body. Pastor Halle stepped forward, not as a shield, but as a sounding board. Truth is a neighbor, he said, voice carrying like a hymn in a wooden hall. It knocks with open hands, not fists, and it waits to be invited in. He looked at the young guardsmen, then at the old veterans in the back. Let's be the kind of house that answers the door with light. Eddie folded the towel once and laid it flat like a small white flag. He set another coffee down, one for the colonel, one for Caleb. The gesture said what the room had already agreed to, decency first. The jukebox hummed, then quieted, as if it knew its place tonight. Even the storm outside matched its breathing to the hall's restraint. The young guardsman cleared his throat and faced the older men. Sir, he told Caleb, I spoke out of turn and out of ignorance. I didn't see the beams holding the roof I stand under every day. I would like to stand right now where I should have stood earlier. He moved without bravado, just one man stepping into a lesson. Chairs scraped softly as the older veterans rose with deliberate calm. They did not crowd, did not loom, did not try to make a wall. They formed a line that looked more like a porch than a barricade. It said, "Welcome to truth, not war to the world beyond the door." And all at once, the VFW hall felt larger than its square footage. The colonel read the room and let a fraction of command fall away. He placed his cap beside the coin as if two histories could coexist. His hands opened at his sides, palms visible, duty unclenched. "Whatever happens," he said, "let it be witnessed in good faith." He was still an officer. He was also a man among neighbors. A veteran with a limp stepped forward until he matched Caleb's line. "We didn't make it home to pick new fights in warm rooms," he said. "We made it home to keep the warm rooms honest and kind." His eyes touched the photos, then the rain, then the hymn cards. "Let's prove we remember how to protect without breaking." Outside, headlights slid along the glass in thin, wet ribbons. Engines idled like restrained animals learning a slower gait. Someone whispered that the SUVs had parked without sirens. The town noticed the courtesy and answered with its own. No panic, no posture, just breath held in agreement. Pastor Holly raised a hand, and the room settled another inch. He did not preach. He offered instructions as simple as prayer. "No shouting," he said, "and no humiliation for anyone who enters. Let questions be asked as if we cared about the answers. Let answers be given as if they could keep a child asleep." Caleb's voice reached only as far as it needed to reach. "We are not here to win," he said, "but to remain ourselves. A town that keeps the light is a town that keeps its word. If there's a ledger to reconcile, we will do it without cruelty." He tapped the coin once, and the room agreed without speaking. The door did not burst open. It sighed open, politely, like a guest. Two men in dark suits stepped through with rain on their shoulders. They scanned faces and saw posture but not threat, presence but not heat. Whatever script they carried began to revise itself in their hands. Mill Creek had chosen its tone, and visitors would have to adapt. The taller agent nodded once to the colonel, once to the pastor. He introduced himself, rank withheld, purpose carefully phrased. "We're here to ask for cooperation," he said, words measured. He did not say custody, did not say violation, did not say arrest. He said the smallest true thing and waited to see who believed him. The colonel's chin lifted one notch toward responsibility, not pride. "Gentlemen," he said, "you're standing on a floor built by a Marine. You're under a roof his hands and others like his kept from leaking. If we can proceed as neighbors, we'll all leave better than we arrived." The agents looked up, then around, and saw the room nod back. Caleb did not ask for a chair, did not seek height. He sought clarity. "I'll answer what I can without selling the dead for comfort," he said. "No numbers that can be traced, no names that can be hurt. Only the truth a town is entitled to so it can keep standing. Restraint is the only uniform I brought with me tonight." One agent opened a folder, then closed it with unhurried care. The paper felt heavier than it looked, like soaked wood in winter. He asked questions that were precise but not needlessly sharp. Caleb gave answers that were honest but never unkind to ghosts. The pastor listened for tremor and heard only conscience breathing. Eddie poured coffee for whoever's hand was empty at the moment. He counted cups the way a foreman counts rafters before a storm. "Refill?" He asked the younger agent, because hospitality is leverage. The man blinked, realized he was cold, and accepted with thanks. Some negotiations are won with mugs warmed twice, not words. The colonel stood at center mass between authority and memory. He did not block. He bridged, translating rank into plain speech. "Gentlemen, the mission was sealed to protect the living," he said. "It began to harm the living when the seal became a forgetting. This town is repairing that harm with calm, not contempt." The taller agent removed his cap and held it against his chest. It was not surrender. It was the grammar of a place he entered. He asked Caleb if Lantern One was a name or a burden. Caleb answered that it was a lantern because others were the oil. The light came from men who stayed when I was told to move. Outside, the rain softened another notch, a metronome easing. The flag settled into a steady ripple, like breath after a hard run. Someone in the back whispered a name and then hushed himself. The agents heard it and did not write it down because wisdom grew. They were learning the difference between record and reverence. "Last question," the younger agent said, softer than when he arrived. "If we ask for silence again, what will you do differently this time?" Caleb looked to the pastor, then to the colonel, then to the town. "I'll keep silence where it saves," he said, "and speak where it heals. Conscience will sign every sentence before it leaves my mouth." The taller agent closed the folder and let his hands rest open. "We can accept that answer," he said, and meant it as an oath. The colonel removed his cap and placed it over his heart in full view. One by one, hats moved, hands rose, eyes lowered, breath steadied. Orders had their place. Conscience had found its language again. Pastor Halle stepped forward only when the silence asked him to. He did not raise his voice. He raised the room's patience instead. Hands open, shoulders square, he took his place between histories. "Gentlemen," he said, "we serve the same good when we serve the truth. Let us not make enemies out of neighbors who share the same roof." The taller agent glanced at the colonel, then back to the pastor's calm. Rain braided down the window in slanted cords, softening the edges. "Reverend, we can finish our questions and be on our way," he said. "Cooperation tonight spares everyone the trouble none of us want. Help us keep this straightforward, and we'll keep it merciful." The pastor nodded once, as if agreeing to carry one more beam. "Mercy begins with how men are addressed," he answered gently. "Not as problems to be solved, but as souls to be kept unharmed. Ask what you must, but remember none of us is a ledger entry. Names are not ink. They are breath, and breath must not be crushed." He turned slightly toward Caleb, not guarding him, honoring him. "Brother, keep your promise to the dead and your duty to the living. Where words would break trust, say little. Where they would heal, speak. Let restraint be your shield and conscience be your captain. Nothing that matters here depends on volume, only on virtue." The colonel's jaw eased as if someone had just loosened a too tight knot. He stood not as an accuser, but as a witness who owed clarity. "I can attest," he said, "that this man saved more lives than I know, that his restraint kept fire where fire belonged and spared our own. If his voice trembles, it will be from reverence, not from guilt." A murmur of assent moved through the veterans like wind through wheat. The young guardsman straightened, cap still pressed to his chest. He did not speak. He let his posture do the small work of apology. The room's temperature settled into workmanlike composure. Mill Creek chose discipline over drama, and the storm approved. The younger agent asked two narrow questions and then paused. Each time, Caleb measured his reply like a carpenter measuring board. He cut away names, dates, and deadly specifics with steady care. What he left intact was the moral spine the town needed to carry. Truth enough to anchor memory. Mercy enough to harm no one. At last the taller agent closed his folder, but not his mind. He studied the pastor as if seeing the architecture of peace. "You would stand here if tempers rose," he said, not quite asking. Pastor Halle offered a weary smile that had weathered many storms. "I would kneel here if that helped, and rise again if it didn't." A flicker of lightning whitened every frame on the memorial wall. For a heartbeat, the faces looked freshly taken, newly remembered. The pastor raised his hand, not to command, but to bless restraint. "Let what we do tonight age well in the memory of our children," he said. "And let no man leave here with less dignity than he brought." He stepped aside then, not retreating, simply clearing a view. Between the agents and the town lay a plain wooden path. Decency. Between the colonel and Caleb lay the same path. Confession without spectacle. What remained to be decided would be decided by gestures, not force. And so the pastor waited, the way a lighthouse waits, quiet, unwavering, sure. Lightning stitched a final seam across the clouds and moved on. Rain thinned into a steady hymn that rafters know how to hold. The door breathed once with the wind and then learned stillness. In that gentled air, the colonel reached for his cap and paused. He looked at Caleb, at the pastor, at the town that had decided to see. Then, slowly, he removed the cap and placed it over his heart. Not a salute to rank, not a signal to command an answer to conscience. The taller agent followed, then the younger, hands settling in respect. Veterans mirrored the gesture, and the young guardsman did too. Decency at last had found a single language everyone could speak. Caleb did not rise. He did not need to rise to be taller than the moment. He set his palm flat on the coin, as if steadying a lantern in wind. Men stayed so others could leave, he said, voice level and clear. That is the only part I have ever needed to say out loud, and the only part the town needs to remember on purpose. Pastor Hal bowed his head and let a prayer walk out unannounced. No verses quoted, no thunder summoned, only thanks offered. Thanks for roofs that hold, for truth that heals, for tempers bridled. Thanks for the living who remember and the dead who taught them how. The prayer ended where it began, in gratitude, not in grievance. The taller agent broke the silence with a sentence measured thin. Ward, he said, we will report that your cooperation satisfied our concern, that your discretion remains intact, and your town is better for tonight. He looked to the colonel, who gave the smallest nod a man can give. There are approvals that outrank signatures. This was one of them. Outside, the flag snapped once and settled into a quiet ripple. A siren sounded in the far distance, then disappeared into weather. Inside, boots eased and shoulders lowered like tools laid down right. Eddie wiped a circle of water from the counter beside the coin. From now on, he said, the story pays for its coffee. Caleb turned the coin face down and then face up again. The chapel engraving caught the neon and held it like stained glass. He could see the faces on the wall reflected in that small circle. Not clearly, just enough to know they were still in the room. Light's not the same as glory, he murmured. It's what lets you work. The colonel stepped closer, words chosen as carefully as screws. I enforced a silence that protected people and punished memory, he said. I cannot unwrite what was done, but I can unlearn the habit of hiding. He tipped his cap once toward Caleb, once toward the pastor, once to the town. Consider this my first day of learning that lesson in public. Double quotes. Pastor Holly moved to the door and opened it to the rinsed night. The rain smelled like fresh lumber and newly turned soil. He looked back at the hall and saw a room that had grown larger. Tomorrow at sunrise, he said, we raise our flag and our thanks, and we'll give a name back to the wall that should have had it all along. No one applauded. No one needed to. The agents left in quiet, and their engines spoke softly by design. The colonel lingered, then followed, carrying a lighter kind of burden. Eddie refilled Caleb's cup and set it down with a grateful nod. The light did not blaze. It endured, and that was the greater miracle. Morning came the way it always comes in Mill Creek, slow and honest, the sky rinsed clean by the night's long rain. The street lamps blinked out one by one as if surrendering to a kinder watch, and Main Street pulled its first quiet breaths. Over the VFW hall, clouds thinned into pale ribbons, and the flag on the pole hung heavy, waiting for hands that knew its worth. Inside, the floor still held the memory of boots and decisions. Outside, the town felt larger, not because it grew, but because it remembered. In that early light, even the puddles looked like mirrors laid out for truth to check its face. Caleb woke before his alarm the way men do who never really sleep through storms. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and listened to the steady drip from the eaves, the familiar house noises that mean a roof was put on right. He dressed in work clothes, not Sunday best denim, flannel, boots that showed their miles, and he pocketed the coin the way a carpenter pockets a pencil. On the kitchen table, a folded paper towel waited beneath a mug, a note from a life lived simply. Coffee's ready, you are loved, go steady. He nodded to the empty room and answered back with a breath that counted as a prayer. Pastor Howell reached the hall before sunrise, keys jingling like small bells of duty. He opened the doors and let the cool air move through, carrying last night's heat away without erasing what it meant. He laid a Bible on the lectern but didn't mark a page. He would speak from the heart and let the morning edit him. He set a small box beneath the flagpole, new screws, a driver, the plate wrapped in brown paper, because even ceremonies need hardware. Then he stood a minute in the doorway, watching the town gather itself like a family waking for chores. The young guardsman arrived first, hat in hand, posture corrected by wisdom earned the hard way. He took the flag rope in his fingers and felt its rough braid, the kind of texture that tells you this job matters. Behind him came two older veterans, the limp and laugh kind of men whose stories live between jokes and rain. They didn't lecture him. They taught him with the way they stood, shoulders squared to a future they hoped would be kinder than their memories. Together, they checked the clips, tested the halyard, and waited for permission from a sky that was just beginning to forgive. Eddie shuffled up with a cardboard tray of coffees, lids ticking with heat, steam finding its breath in the cool. He handed them out the way a foreman hands out nails, no speech, all purpose. Black or cream? He asked the morning, already knowing the answers. He set one cup aside, the way you set a chair at the table for anyone who can't be with you but still keeps you honest. Then he glanced toward the pastor's box and touched the lid, curious and reverent at once, like a man reaching for a story he intends to carry without breaking it. The colonel came on foot, coat buttoned, eyes clear, the night's confession having done its quiet labor. He didn't bring rank. He brought presence, which sits lighter and lasts longer. He took his place not in front, not behind, but among, the way a man does when he's finally learned the difference between authority and stewardship. When he nodded to Caleb across the small knot of townsfolk, the gesture carried the weight of a letter long overdue and finally delivered. No words were necessary. Dawn already knew how to translate. A few families formed a crescent near the flag, kids rubbing sleep from their eyes, mothers straightening collars, fathers telling the lawn to behave. A school bus rumbled somewhere in the distance like a promise that today would become tomorrow if everyone kept their part. A widow set a hand on the stone step, fingertips reading old names like Braille made of grief and pride. The town wasn't a crowd. It was a choir holding the note of a shared memory, waiting for the downbeat only conscience can give. And when the wind lifted, small and certain, the hymn found them. Pastor Hale lifted his voice just enough to reach the edges of the gathering. "We are here," he said, "because peace is a structure that needs maintenance." He nodded toward the wall of frames inside, and to the flag above them all, and to the faces turned toward morning light. "Last night, we agreed to remember with care instead of anger, with truth instead of spectacle, with charity instead of fear." His eyes found the young guardsman, and then the colonel, and then Caleb. A triangle of accountability that felt like a good blueprint. "Let our actions age well like wood oiled for weather." Caleb stepped to the rope and put his hand beside the young soldier's, an old strength next to a new one. "Slow and steady," he said, not as instruction but as inheritance. They hauled together on the count the pastor gave, and the flag rose without complaint, fabric discovering the wind like lungs after a long night. When it reached the peak, the clips sang their small bright note, and the line settled with a craftsman's tidy slack. The first sunlight caught the red, then the white, then the blue, and the town answered with the silence reserved for births, vows, and graves. For a long moment, they simply stood, no applause, no speech overrun by feeling trying to outrun itself. The only sounds were the flag's quiet ripple, the town's gentle waking, and a robin rehearsing courage on a telephone wire. Pastor Halle closed his eyes and said the smallest prayer he knew. Thank you for the men who stayed and the men who learned to see. When he opened them, he nodded toward the box, and Eddie knew what to do. The morning had one more task to make the night's truth permanent. Eddie knelt and opened the box like a man revealing bread to a hungry table. The brown paper fell away to a rectangle of brushed metal, letters cut clean enough to catch the sun without boasting. The screws gleamed like tiny oaths waiting to be spoken, allowed 1/4 turn at a time. Caleb touched the edge and then withdrew his hand, not out of doubt, but to leave the honor of lifting to others. The pastor picked up the driver and stepped aside, placing it in the young guardsman's hands. The colonel cleared the mounting space under the flag with the sleeve of his coat, a small penance gladly paid. He held the plaque in place while the young soldier drove the first screw, steady, square, the tool's soft whir like a promise kept. An older veteran took the second, aligning it with the first, checking level by feel and by faith. Eddie set the final 2 screws on his open palm, and the colonel accepted them as if receiving a folded note from someone he'd wronged. 2 more turns, and the metal met the brick with the right kind of certainty. When they stepped back, the words faced the town with a courage that needed no volume. Dedicated to Lantern 1, for the light that never went out. The line seemed to warm as the sun found it. Not glowing, exactly holding, like a beam that won't split under weather. Caleb read it once and lowered his eyes, the coin warm in his pocket as if answering a roll call long deferred. The pastor rested a hand on his shoulder, the way men steady each other without saying they're afraid of falling. The silence that followed was not empty, it was inhabited. A little girl, someone's granddaughter, slid a paper flag drawing into the corner of the frame, tucking it under the edge with the care of a librarian shelving the most important book. For the men who stayed, she whispered, uncertain whether whispering was required or simply right. Her mother started to pull her back, but the pastor shook his head and smiled. Sometimes the town needs a small hand to do what big hands forget to. The paper held fast in the morning breeze, brave as any banner. The colonel removed his cap, not because protocol demanded it, but because gratitude did. I can't restore what paperwork took, he said, voice steady, trimmed of self-defense. But I can keep from stealing again by calling forgetting what it is. He looked to Caleb, then to the frames inside, then to the flag above. Consider me enlisted in the maintenance crew truth division. The line earned a few quiet smiles, the kind that agree without needing signatures. Eddie, never one for speeches, cleared his throat and found he had something worth saying. We'll keep coffee hot for anyone who needs to tell a name before it slips, he offered. And if a story comes in wet from the weather, we'll dry it off before we put it on the wall. He nodded toward the plaque as if it were a living thing that might get thirsty. This one gets refills on the house till the house falls down, which it won't. The laugh that followed was soft and right, a brace set snug. Pastor Halle lifted the Bible but didn't open it, choosing to read the room instead. No sermon, he said, just a charge. He pointed gently at the plaque, then at the crowd, then at the flag that had found its rhythm. Remembering is not a holiday. It's a habit. Make it a chore you love, not a task you dread. Sweep your porch, mind your word. Carry your neighbor's name like a tool you use every day. Caleb stepped closer and laid his palm flat on the brick beneath the plaque, feeling the building hold his weight. They taught me to leave things stronger than I found them, he said. Roofs, steps, tempers, towns. He turned to the young guardsman and offered the coin for a moment, letting him feel its heft. This stands for a chapel and a promise. We both know what it costs to keep the light. The young man nodded, eyes bright with the gentle ache of understanding. A breeze lifted, turning the paper flag just enough to show the crayon-streaked blue behind the red bars. Somewhere down the block, a shop sign flipped from closed to open with a cheerful click. Life resumed, but not as if nothing had happened, rather as if the foundation had been inspected and found sound. The town dispersed in twos and threes, leaving behind footprints that pointed forward instead of around in circles. The flag kept its steady conversation with the wind. Before he left, the colonel looked once more at the words on the metal and saluted, not military exactly, but the old human gesture of a hand acknowledging a heart. "For the light that never went out," he repeated softly, committing the phrase to a ledger that finally mattered. The pastor locked the hall and pocketed the keys with a craftsman's satisfaction. The day's first job done right. Caleb turned toward his shop, where pews waited for sanding and a door needed to stop catching in damp weather. And the town, warmed by a good morning's work, walked on with a steadier step. Caleb's workshop smelled like cedar and rain, a clean, honest scent that could calm a freight train. Light fell through the high windows and long planks, turning dust into slow-moving constellations. A church pew lay on trestles, half-sanded, its scars visible but no longer sharp to the touch. He set paper on wood and moved with small, even strokes, listening for where the grain sighed. Good work, he knew, was a prayer with calluses answered one careful pass at a time. The door eased open, and the young guardsman stepped in, hat off, eyes searching for permission. He carried nothing but willingness and the memory of a hard lesson that hadn't soured him. "Sir, if you're still sanding, I can carry, hold sweep, or keep quiet," he offered simply. Caleb nodded toward the second block, a smile barely visible beneath the morning stubble. "Start with the corners," he said. "They're where people get hurt when nobody looks close." The boy learned the rhythm quickly, shoulders settling into the slow grace of steady labor. Sand, lift, check, breathe words were unnecessary where purpose already filled the air. Shavings gathered like curled sentences on the floor, each one a fragment of something rough made smooth. A radio in the corner murmured weather and farm prices, the ordinary news of a faithful town. Between strokes, the men listened to the sound of edges becoming kinder for strangers they'd never meet. Caleb showed how to wrap the paper tight so it wouldn't chatter or leave chatter marks. He taught pressure by feel, patience by example, and humility by not naming it aloud. "Most folks see the pew and not the splinters that never happened," he said softly. "That's the job, prevent hurt before hurt tries to introduce itself." The boy nodded, absorbing a doctrine older than orders and just as binding. A knock at the frame announced the colonel, unbuttoned, carrying 2 coffees and no speeches. He set the cups down and took up a broom as if it were a commission delivered by conscience. "Figure I owe rent for space I used last night," he said, half smile, eyes clear. "Payment accepted," Caleb answered, and the 3 of them worked in honest silence. Redemption, the room decided, was best expressed in sawdust and sweat. Sun climbed the wall and reached the pew's curve, warming the wood like a hand on a shoulder. Caleb ran his palm along the rail and felt almost nothing, the test a craftsman trusts. "Good," he murmured, and the word was both verdict and blessing for the work and the workers. "Sit a while," he told the boy. "If it's right, you feel encouraged to rest, not afraid to bleed." They sat, and the bench held not just weight, but the meaning of being held. Pastor Halle appeared with a small paper bag, the kind that crinkles like laughter. "Biscuits," he said, and enough butter to make an apology go down smooth. He set them out on a scrap of canvas, communion in a language the town loved. "2 questions," he added, eyes kind. "Is the pew ready, and are we?" Caleb answered yes to the first and let the second answer itself through their work. When the boy rose to go, he hesitated the way a man does at the edge of a vow. "Sir," he asked, "what should I remember when I'm tempted to talk before I've served?" Caleb placed the challenge coin in his hand for a breath, letting the weight teach. "Remember that light is for working, not for being admired," he said gently. "Then go do quiet things that keep roofs from leaking and tempers from splitting." The colonel swept a final line across the floor, gathering the day's confessions into a neat pile. "Some debts can't be paid," he said, "but they can be honored by joining the crew." He leaned the broom, took his cup, and saluted the pew with a nod that meant respect. Not rank. Outside, Main Street carried on mail truck, school laughter, a dog arguing with a squirrel. Inside, the workshop returned to its regular heartbeat, satisfied but not finished. Caleb turned off the radio, hung his apron, and opened the door to the afternoon. Light spilled in, bright enough to work by and gentle enough to live under. He looked toward the VFW, small as a thumbnail from here, and felt the town stand taller. Some heroes don't disappear, the day seemed to say. They just keep building. And with that, he went to plane a stubborn door, the kind that sticks when the weather changes. Honor doesn't end with paperwork. It lives in the hands that keep towns standing, patient, faithful, and unseen. Have you or someone you love ever had to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost? Share your story in the comments.